it's difficult being part of I'm just thinking like sociological, right? Just thinking about being a part of a faith group. Like what do you do when someone raises a question that you don't know how to answer? It's like, well, you don't worry, because you then ask people who are smarter than you, and you just hope that what they have to share with you will put you at ease.
Mm-hmm.
And honestly, I think when you're in the kind of the enthusiasm of the faith like you were or like I was, even if no one has a satisfying answer, you just assume that it's out there, or you just brush it aside. Or
no, I had a few interactions on my mission that kind of shook me a little bit, right? I mean, I grew up in Orem, Utah. Everyone was LDS. When you're surrounded by that kind of cultural homogeneity, you don't really question very much. You kind of just think, like growing up, every now and then I would encounter what we were taught to think of as like anti-Mormon talking points.
Yeah.
Right. And they always seemed so ridiculous to me because they were so foreign to my experience. Right. And then I was told that they were lies. Right. And so I'll give you an example of like a few things. I remember one time going to what we call general conference in the LDS faith. It's like twice a year, church members gather in Salt Lake City and all the church leaders speak there. All the prophets and apostles and all that. It's a very big deal. And there's always people out there protesting. And I remember one time being there with some friends in high school, and one of them handed me this flyer. And I remember reading it out loud to them and just laughing. They're like, because it said on there, Mormons believe that Adam is God or something like that. So, I mean, fast forward, I kind of found out later that this actually used to be something that LDS prophets taught.
I advanced a doctrine with regard to Adam being our father and God. It is one of the most glorious revealments of the economy of heaven. Brigham Young, 1861.
But at the time, I just thought, where do they get this stuff? Like, how ridiculous is that? When you go on a mission and you're encountering people, especially in the Bible Belt, some people at least know their faith well. Not as many as is advertised. I remember in my mission, I used to joke, they call it the Bible Belt because most people have a Bible somewhere in their house. But every now and then you would encounter people who really knew their faith. In fact, I remember encountering a Catholic on my mission who challenged me on the LDS view of the fall of Adam and Eve. Because in LDS teaching, the fall is kind of seen as like a good thing, like something that God wanted to happen. It was part of his plan from the start. And there's a sense in which a Catholic can affirm that. Like, God sees all from the beginning. All things are present to him at once. And so, in his providence, the fall is something that he knows about, right?
Oh, happy fault, which merited.
Yeah, happy fault that merited for so great a savior, as we say at Easter. And, but in the LDS sense, it was just sort of like, no, it was like a necessary thing. Like it had to be this way because this is like the eternal scheme of things that, we're premortal spirits that live beforehand, and God creates this new world and people have to come here. And the whole reason we're coming here is in order to have a mortal experience where we experience like the hardness and the harshness of life to help us grow and to become more godlike. And a necessary precondition of that is the fall. And so it's sort of seen as like a good thing. And I had a Catholic that I was, this is from door knocking, and he said something like, how could a good God command them to not do something that he kind of like secretly wanted them to do, Adam and Eve, right?
Yeah.
And it was like the first time I'd had a question I didn't have a ready answer for. I thought, I don't know. I don't know that. And for days, it just like bothered me, just kind of mulling it in my head,
I have another question as you're speaking. I'm thinking this through. So, and I don't want to get into the weeds here because I want to go the trajectory of your story, but am I right in thinking that Mormons believe that God, who we worship, who Mormons worship, was once a man?
So I'll give a qualified yes to that, and the qualification is this. It used to be totally yes. Like when I was growing up, that was talked about openly all the time. Okay. We had this little couplet. It was like, and this was taught by an LDS prophet, as God, as man is, God once was.
Yeah.
As God is, man may become.
Yeah.
And so totally that was the explicit teaching of Joseph Smith toward the end of his life, that God, and they still teach, it's in their scriptures, that God has a physical corporeal body, as tangible as man's, it says. Like the Father specifically has a body as tangible as man's. I would say that they don't emphasize that as much now. as they used to. So I think some Latter-day Saints, if you were to ask them, would kind of give like, I don't know.
Okay.
If God was man the same way we were, certainly plenty would still say yes. But yeah, go ahead.
Well, here's what I was going to say. I mean, if it's true that the Father was once a man like we are, and if sin is sort of a necessary condition to advance to godhood, wouldn't it follow that God was once a sinner?
No, not necessarily. No. It's not necessary that you sin,
okay.
But it sort of was necessary somehow that like, and they don't actually describe the fall as a sin.
Okay.
They use the word transgression, which I think is more like kind of King James language. Definitely LDS scriptures talk about like the transgression of Adam and Eve. And so it's almost presented, and some of this gets into like LDS temple theology.
Just want to back up. So would a Mormon who affirms that God the Father, whom Mormons worship today, if they affirm that he was once a man, would they say, but as a man he never sinned?
Yeah, well, Jesus was a man, but never sinned.
Yeah.
Right? So,
but I'm talking specifically about the Father.
Well, he could have been like that. That's what I'm saying.
It could have been like that, but it seems to me like you should get that right if you're going to say that God was once a man.
They would definitely say he could have been a sinner. I think that would not. Because they believe that every person can become like God the Father pretty much in all respects. Like God's nature in Mormonism is not different than ours. We have the exact same, we don't share one nature with him, like not in a Trinitarian sense, but we are the same kind of being as him. Exactly the same. Like there's no ontological difference between God and us. He is just this was Joseph Smith's later theology, he's a more progressed and advanced human, essentially.
If I'm getting into something you want to talk about later, just tell me, okay? But I guess the question I would have is if I were a Mormon and the Mormons around me say, well, look, we don't know. Like there's some mystery there. We don't know if God the Father was once a man, let alone whether he sinned. That's not something, fair enough. But if you've got the prophet, quote unquote, saying that that's the way things were, wouldn't that cause you some trouble? Like,
it caused me a little trouble.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, that's...
And then how did you deal with that? Maybe when that...
I think, so I'll say one thing about my mission directly relating to this, and then I'll talk about kind of how I dealt with it. So I talked about how growing up, I was exposed to these kind of things that I was told were anti-Mormon lies, right? Like, you don't have to believe, don't worry about those things. Like, that's just a lie. Like,
you use the example of Adam being God.
I used the example of Adam being God, or like say even Joseph Smith practicing polygamy. Growing up, I was told that's just a lie. He didn't do that. Part of this was like I was the last generation of Latter-day Saints that grew up pre-internet, or at the very, very beginning of the internet, right? Most Latter-day Saints now growing up, they all know that Joseph Smith practiced polygamy. The church is, and to their credit, is much more clear about its history than at least that I received growing up. But I was a very studious kid, and there were all sorts of things that I encountered, and when I would ask my leaders, they'd be like, no, that's a lie. Joseph Smith was never a Mason, that's a lie. Joseph Smith never practiced polygamy, that's a lie. We never taught that Adam was God, that's a lie, those types of things. And then on my mission, I was in an apartment with some other missionaries, and one of them had a little kind of handbook of Mormon apologetics. And I've always been like a very voracious reader. So I grabbed it and I read it cover to cover. And it exposed me to a lot of these things. It was basically like, these things aren't lies. They actually are true.
And you've got a Mormon telling you it's true.
Yes, right.
It's not
along with apologetic responses of like, here's how you can
point.
Yeah, they concede the point, but then help you kind of like contextualize it and understand it. But that did rock me a little bit on my mission, because it was the first instance that I had where I realized that the LDS church and history that had been presented to me as a kid might not be fully accurate, and that I might not always be able to depend on the church to give me like a full accurate account of its own history.
Hey, thank you so much for watching. Before you go, do us a favor, leave a comment, let us know what you thought of the video, like, and subscribe.